Her own father threw her away like trash. He called her a pig, a disgrace, a daughter so fat she shamed the family name, so he gave her to a slave as a final, cruel punishment. He wanted to break her. He wanted to humiliate her. But what Lord Cashin didn't know was that he hadn't just thrown his daughter away. He had handed his greatest enemy a sword. The stone floor was cold and hard against Livia's skin. Her elbows were scraped raw, her fine silk dress was torn, and the heavy oak door of the servants' quarters slammed shut behind her with a sound like a casket closing. The world she knew was gone. The guards her father had posted outside didn't even look back. Their job was done. The package was delivered. Inside the dark, musty room, her father's voice still hammered against her skull. "You shame this family. Let him have you. A few weeks of humiliation will teach you to eat like a lady." That was it. No mercy. No last-minute reprieve. Livia, the noble daughter of Vailmont's most powerful merchant, was now property, something broken, something to be discarded. She pushed herself up, her whole body trembling, and finally looked at the man who was now her keeper, her owner. He was barefoot, his trousers frayed at the ankles. Dirt was caked under his fingernails, and his shirt was little more than rags hanging from a pair of broad, tired shoulders. A long, jagged scar ran down one forearm, a pale white line against his sun-darkened skin. She'd seen him before, shoveling manure in the stables while her father barked orders at him. His name was Celas, a slave bought from the mountain folk during a famine. He was supposed to be her punishment, her shame, but the look in his eyes wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. He just looked stunned. He stared at her, this noble girl dumped at his feet, and he looked like he didn't know whether to run or kneel. She was his now. He could do anything he wanted to her. Her voice came out as a ragged whisper. "You don't have to kneel." He blinked, as if her words were a language he'd forgotten. Slowly, carefully, he took a step forward, not close enough to be a threat, but close enough that she could smell the faint scent of hay and clean earth that clung to him. "I don't want a gift," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "I didn't ask for this." "Neither did I," she choked out. The silence in the room was deafening. There was nothing but the crackle of the tiny fire in the hearth and the sound of their breathing. And then, betraying her completely, Livia's stomach let out a loud, rumbling growl. Mortified, she clapped a hand over it, her cheeks burning with shame. He could starve her. He could beat her for being hungry. He could do anything. But Celis didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just turned to the hearth, grabbed a small, dented tin pot, and filled it with water from a bucket. "I'll make some broth," he said, his back to her. She stared at him, confused. Every instinct she had, everything she'd ever learned about the cruelty of men, told her this was a trick. You're not going to hurt me?" He paused, his hand hovering over the fire. He glanced back over his shoulder, and his eyes were tired, but clear. "Do you think I'm like your father?" The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever spoken about Lord Cashin like that, not with such simple, brutal honesty. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. A sad, quiet truth spoken in a dusty room by a man who had nothing. In that moment, Livia realized that the cruelest monsters didn't always live in the shadows. Sometimes, they wore fine clothes and held noble titles. When the broth was ready, he handed the warm cup to her. Her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled it. She drank it down in silence, the simple, salty warmth a stark contrast to the cold fear that had been her only companion for hours. He didn't press her. He didn't ask questions. He just sat by the fire, sharpening a tool with a whetstone, humming a low, unfamiliar tune. That night, he gave her the only cot in the room. He laid a thin, scratchy blanket for himself on the floor by the dying embers of the fire. It was the first act of kindness Livia had known in years, and as she lay there in the dark, listening to the soft sound of his breathing, a single, terrifying thought bloomed in her mind. This wasn't a punishment. It felt like being saved. But she was wrong. This wasn't salvation. This was just the beginning of the nightmare. And the man sleeping on the floor wasn't her savior. He was the key to a door she never knew existed. A door that led straight to hell. The next morning, Livia woke up aching and stiff, the smell of dust and sorrow still clinging to her gown. For a terrifying second, the room was empty. Panic seized her. Had he left? Had he gone to her father to complain? Were the guards coming back to drag her to an even worse fate? The door creaked open, and Celis walked in, his arms loaded with fresh firewood, his face damp with morning sweat. "You're awake," he said simply. He didn't smile, but his eyes were calm. He laid out a small meal on the rickety table, a piece of dark bread, a few salted plums, and a mug of water. Then, to her utter astonishment, he sat down across from her, not at her feet, not standing in the corner like a servant. He sat across from her like an equal. Livia stared at him. "Aren't you afraid someone will see? That I'll report you?" A faint, wry smile touched his lips for the first time. "You're not a noble lady anymore." The words should have stung. They should have been another brand of her shame. But coming from him, they didn't sound like an insult. They sounded like a statement of fact, a release. Later that day, driven by a strange impulse, she offered to help him sweep the barn. He looked at her as if she'd grown a second head. "You?" "Yes, me," she insisted, rolling up the sleeves of her ruined gown. "I have hands." She was a disaster. She was clumsy and slow. She tripped over a hay bale, shrieked when a mouse scurried past her foot, and nearly knocked herself out with the broom handle. Celis tried to stifle his laughter. He really did. But soon a deep, rumbling chuckle escaped him. It was a warm, honest sound, and it filled the dusty barn with something other than misery. That evening, as they sat by the fire once more, the same quiet ritual as the night before, Livia finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why haven't you asked me anything?" He looked up from the leather strap he was mending. "Like what?" "Like what I did. Why my father gave me away. Why I look like this," she whispered, gesturing vaguely at her own body. Celis leaned back against the wall, stretching his long legs out. "I don't care what he told me," he said, his voice even. "And I've seen the way you look. There's nothing wrong with it." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. "You might be the only person in the world who thinks so." "I doubt that," he said softly. "But even if it were true, I'm not interested in what everyone else thinks." The air between them grew thick, charged with something unspoken, something fragile and new. "You're kind," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's a dangerous thing to be." He met her gaze across the flickering firelight, his eyes dark and serious. "Not as dangerous as being cruel," he replied. And in that moment, Livia felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, foolish spark in the vast darkness of her life. She thought, maybe this was it. Maybe this was where her story turned. Maybe this quiet, gentle man was her new beginning. She was so naive, so wrong, because kindness was a weapon in the world they lived in. And Celis was about to prove he was the most dangerous man she had ever met. 2 days passed, then 3. By the 4th day, the estate was buzzing with rumors. Lord Cashin was hosting some foreign nobles. He was arranging a marriage for his youngest daughter, now that Livia, the embarrassing older one, was out of the way. Livia tried to ignore it all. She focused on the simple, grounding rhythm of her new life, mucking out stalls, carrying water, kneading dough. With every blister on her hands, she felt a piece of the old, helpless Livia flake away. Celis never treated her like a burden. He taught her, patient and silent, how to do the work. He never once made her feel small. But the world outside their small bubble hadn't forgotten her. One afternoon, as she was hauling a bucket of water across the courtyard, a snide voice cut through the air. "Look, the pig princess escaped her pen." Livia froze. 3 of the kitchen boys were leaning against the stable wall, smirking at her. She even waddles like one, another one jeered. The bucket slipped from her trembling hands, splashing water all over her feet. Before she could even think of a reply, Celis was there. He seemed to materialize out of thin air, a silent, imposing shadow. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He just stood there and stared at the boys, his face a mask of cold fury. "Say it again," he said. His voice was quiet, deadly. The boys' smirks vanished. They shuffled their feet, suddenly very interested in the ground. "I said," Celis repeated, taking a slow step forward. "Say it again." They didn't. They scattered like rats, disappearing back into the kitchens. Celis turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Don't listen to them." But it was too late. The damage was done. I need a moment," she stammered, and fled. She ran to the barn, their cruel laughter echoing in her ears, and hid behind a stack of hay bales, silent tears streaming down her face. Celis found her there a few minutes later. He didn't speak. He just sat down beside her in the dusty quiet and waited. When her sobs finally subsided, she whispered, "You can't protect me from all of them." "No," he agreed, his voice somber. "But I can protect you from believing them." That night, something shifted. She noticed the way he looked at her when she wasn't paying attention, the way his fingers would brush against hers when he handed her a tool, the way his voice seemed to soften whenever he said her name. Her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, started to beat a little faster whenever he was near. She had been given to him as a punishment, but it was slowly, terrifyingly, starting to feel like love. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because the world was about to remind them both exactly what they were: a discarded noble girl and a slave. And happiness was a luxury neither of them was allowed to have. The reminder came at dawn, in an envelope sealed with blood-red wax. A rider thundered up the road, his horse lathered in sweat, its breath pluming in the crisp morning air. Messengers were not an uncommon sight at the estate, but they were always for Lord Cashin. This one was different. This one asked for Celis by name. That alone was enough to make the other servants stare. Celis met the rider outside the barn. Livia was inside, her hands covered in flour, her mind 1,000 miles away. She didn't hear the hushed, urgent exchange of words. She didn't see the messenger shove the letter into Celis's hand and gallop away without a backward glance. But she saw his face when he walked back inside. It was a pale, blank mask. All the warmth, all the quiet kindness was gone. "I have to leave," he said, his voice flat. He placed the letter on the table as if it were a venomous snake. "I have to go to the mountain provinces." "What?" Livia's hands fell still, dough clinging to her fingers. "Why?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pushed the letter toward her. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. The paper was expensive, the handwriting sharp and elegant. "To Celis of Oran," it read, "Your mother lies dying. Come quickly if you wish to see her one last time. You are never forgotten, but if you delay, all that will remain is regret." It was signed with a single name, Ezra. She read it 3 times, the words blurring. You have a family?" she asked, her voice small. "There wasn't much to tell," he replied, already gathering a small satchel from the corner. "My father died in the famine. My mother, I thought she was gone too. Ezra is her brother, my uncle. How long has it been?" He paused, his back to her. 7 years, he said quietly, "since the day I was sold." The silence in the room was thick with everything they hadn't said. 7 years, a whole lifetime. Livia felt a cold dread creeping into her heart. It was a selfish, ugly feeling, but she couldn't stop it. He was leaving. He was going back to a life she knew nothing about, a life that didn't include her. "You're coming back, right?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He turned then and looked at her, his eyes searching her face. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a single sharp nod. "Yes." But she saw it, a flicker of uncertainty in the depths of his gaze, a shadow that his promise couldn't quite banish. He was lying, or at least he wasn't telling her the whole truth. As he packed, she surreptitiously tucked a small jar of honey into his bag. "For your journey," she mumbled, pretending to be busy sweeping. He gave her a small, sad smile. They walked together to the edge of the estate, where the main road snaked down into the valley. The sun was just beginning to burn away the morning mist. "Take this," she said, pressing a small, round object into his hand. It was a button from the sleeve of her gown, the very one she had been wearing the night her father cast her out. It was worthless, but it was hers. "So you don't forget to come back," she whispered. "I'll sew it back on for you." He closed his fingers around it tightly. Then, before she could react, he leaned in and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of reverence, of farewell. "I will come back," he promised, his voice a low whisper against her skin. "No matter what I find there." And then he turned and walked away, not looking back once. Livia stood there and watched until he was just a small speck on the horizon. As he disappeared from view, he pulled the letter from his pocket. He looked at it one more time. The wax seal wasn't a simple family crest from the mountains. It was the intricate sigil of a noble house, House Briarhelm. And the message wasn't about his dying mother. That was a lie, a necessary cruelty. It was a summons, a threat. And he had to obey, because if he didn't, the people who sent it wouldn't just come for him, they would come for Livia. 3 weeks crawled by. 3 weeks of silence. Every day, Livia looked down the road, hoping to see a familiar figure walking towards her. Every night, she curled up on the small cot, her hand clutching the empty spot on her sleeve where the button used to be. The barn felt colder without him, emptier. The other servants, who had once mocked her, now left her alone. They saw the change in her, the quiet strength. Or maybe they were just afraid of the ghost of Celis's fury, which still seemed to linger in the stable yard. It was in the 4th week that everything changed forever. She was feeding the chickens when 2 guards in her father's livery rode up. Their faces were grim. "Lady Livia," one of them said, his voice stiff and formal. "Lord Cashin requests your presence." Livia didn't even look up from the feed bucket. "I'm not his daughter anymore," she said, her voice flat. "He made that very clear." "You misunderstand, my lady," the second guard said, dismounting. "Your father is dying." Livia froze, the bucket suddenly heavy in her hand. "What?" "He was thrown from his horse last week. The healers say he won't last the night. He's been asking for you." She thought she would feel a surge of triumph, of vindication. But all she felt was a cold, heavy dread in the pit of her stomach. He was a monster. He had thrown her away. But he was still her father. The manor was just as she remembered it, cold, opulent, and utterly devoid of warmth. But this time, no one sneered at her. The servants averted their eyes, whispering behind their hands. They led her straight to the master chamber. He was propped up on a mountain of silk pillows, his face pale and waxy, his breathing shallow. When his eyes fluttered open and landed on her, they filled with weak, roomy tears. "Livia," he rasped. You came." She stood by the door, refusing to go any closer. "You summoned me." A spasm of pain crossed his face. "I was wrong," he wheezed. "Wrong about everything. I thought if I punished you, I could fix you, make you acceptable. But there was nothing broken to begin with, was there?" Livia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Oh, there was," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "But it wasn't me." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I sent you to that slave, that boy, as a lesson. But I see now, he was the only one who ever deserved you." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Tell him. Thank you." She stepped forward then, against her better judgment, and sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the man who had caused her so much pain, and in the end all she felt was a vast, empty pity. "I forgive you," she whispered. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "Not for you. For me." A faint, rattling sigh escaped his lips. And then, Lord Cashin, the great and powerful merchant, was still. The funeral was as grand and empty as his life had been. Livia didn't shed a single tear. She felt like a ghost walking through her own past. As soon as it was over, she turned her back on the cold marble of the manor and walked back to the only place that felt like home. Back to the barn. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The little room was dark and cold. She was truly alone now, but she wasn't. A figure was standing by the fireplace, his silhouette framed by the dying embers. He was cloaked in snow and exhaustion, but it was him. It was Celis. She didn't walk. She ran. She launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and road dust. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her like steel bands, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. They stood like that for a long time, saying nothing. There were no words big enough. Finally, she pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I thought you weren't coming back. I told you I would," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I keep my promises." "Your mother?" she began, but he gently put a finger to her lips. "She's at peace," he said, his eyes veiled. It was another lie, another piece of the terrible truth he was hiding to protect her. "But she left me something. A journal. She wrote about you." Livia blinked. "Me?" "She dreamed of the girl I would love someday," he whispered, his thumb brushing her cheek. "She said she would be brave and kind and stronger than any man. She said I would know her by the way she stood up to cruelty without letting it poison her heart." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "I missed you. I missed you more," he murmured. He reached into his satchel and pulled out her button, placing it gently in her palm. "Time to sew this back on." She laughed, a watery, broken sound. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the strength of his arms, she let herself believe. She let herself hope. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But the world had one more twist in store for them. One final cruel joke left to play. Later that night, another letter arrived. It wasn't from a long-lost relative or a forgotten friend. It was sealed with the black wax of a creditor. To Lady Livia of Valemont, it began. "We regret to inform you of a significant debt owed to our family by your late father. As his sole heir, this debt now falls to you. Payment must be rendered immediately, or we will be forced to collect what we are owed in other ways." The candle trembled in Livia's hand. The hope that had bloomed in her heart withered and died. Her father hadn't just left her with scars, he had left her in chains. The number was written at the bottom of the page, stark and brutal in the flickering candlelight. 2,000 gold pieces. An impossible sum. A king's ransom. It was a debt she could never hope to pay in 100 lifetimes. "It's a cage," she whispered, her voice hollow. "He built me a cage, even in death." Celis took the letter from her trembling fingers. He read it once, his face grim, then a second time, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords of rope. This was it. This was what the summons had been about. House Briarhelm was making their move. "They can't do this," Livia said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "I didn't know about this. It's not my debt." "Nobles don't care about what's fair," Celis said, his voice a low growl. "They only care about what's written on paper. To them, this letter is law." She sank onto the stool by the fire, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "Then we run," she said, her eyes wide with panic. "We pack what little we have, and we disappear before they can find us." But Celis didn't move. He stood staring into the flames, his expression dark and calculating. "No," he said finally, "running makes us pray. They'll hunt us, and the farther we run, the worse it will be when they finally catch us. Then what do we do? She cried, her voice breaking. We have nothing. We can't fight them. He turned from the fire to look at her, and for the first time she saw the true steel in his eyes. It was a cold, hard glint she hadn't seen before, the look of a man who had survived things she couldn't even imagine. We don't have to fight them all, he said quietly. We just have to buy ourselves time. 3 days later, they came. A woman and 2 men, all dressed in black, their horses gleaming, their boots polished to a mirror shine. They didn't look like collectors. They looked like executioners. The woman dismounted, her movements graceful and predatory. She had sharp features and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. I am Lady Kalia Thorne, she announced, her voice like shards of ice. I represent House Briarhelm. We've come for what we are owed. Livia stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. Celis stood just behind her, a silent, unmovable wall of muscle and shadow. I received your letter, Livia said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I cannot pay this debt. Lady Kalia raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. We are aware, which is why we are prepared to offer an alternative. Your father, in his desperation, offered up collateral. Her cold eyes raked over Livia from head to toe, a slow, insulting appraisal. He offered you. A wave of nausea washed over Livia. He had sold her. Again. Celis stepped forward, his body radiating a palpable menace. She is not for sale. That is not for you to decide, Kalia replied, her gaze flicking to Celis with a flicker of something that looked like recognition. The terms are legally binding, but House Briarhelm is merciful. We will give her a choice. Pay the debt, surrender yourself as payment, or, she paused, letting the silence hang in the air, you can serve. Serve? Livia whispered. Indentured servitude, Kalia said, a cruel smirk touching her lips. You will live at our estate. You will cook, clean, and attend to our needs for a term of 10 years. At the end of that term, the debt will be considered paid in full. Celis let out a short, harsh laugh. And how many survive those 10 years? Lady Kalia's smile didn't waver. That depends entirely on their willingness to please. They were given 2 days. 2 days to choose between slavery and a different kind of slavery. That night, Livia couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. Her father's betrayal was a living thing, coiling in her gut like a serpent. I can't let them take you, Celis said, his voice a low growl in the darkness of the barn. He had been pacing for hours, a caged wolf. And if I go willingly, she whispered from her cot, to protect you. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his silhouette a dark slash against the faint moonlight. You won't. You said we couldn't run. Her voice rose, cracking with despair. What other way is there, Celis? We have nothing. In 2 long strides, he crossed the room and knelt beside her cot. His face was inches from hers, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. You have me, he said, his voice fierce, raw. You have me, Livia, and I will stand between you and anyone who tries to take you away. Even if they kill you? She whispered. He didn't even flinch. I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees without you. The next morning, Livia made a decision. She wrote a desperate, hasty letter, her hands shaking so badly she could barely form the words. She sealed it with wax melted from a candle. Take this to the trade outpost, she told Celis, pressing it into his hand. Give it to the courier. It's for Lady Rosund of Hillville. Celis frowned. Who is she? My mother's sister, my aunt. She hated my father and left the court years ago. If she's still alive, she's our only hope. He looked down at the letter, then back at her, his expression unreadable. I'll leave tonight, he said. But as he rode out under the light of the full moon, another, more terrible plan was forming in Livia's mind. A plan to save the only person who had ever shown her kindness. A plan that would cost her everything. When Celis returned 2 days later, his heart soaring with the courier's promise to deliver the letter, The barn was empty. Livia was gone. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, just her neatly folded quilt on the cot and the faint scent of rosemary she always left behind. A cold, black dread filled Celis's chest. He burst out of the barn and scanned the ground. Wagon tracks, not 2 hours old, leading east. He didn't hesitate. He swung himself back onto his horse and galloped after them, his mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. He found them by a stream in the woods. Lady Kalia, her men, and Livia sitting stiff and straight in the back of a carriage, her hands bound in front of her. She had given herself up. She had sacrificed herself for him. They didn't hear him coming until it was too late. He was a whirlwind of vengeance, an avenging angel armed with a wood axe and righteous fury. The first guard went down with a sickening crack. The second barely had time to draw his sword before Celis was on him, a blur of motion and brutal efficiency. He moved with a speed and skill that no simple, stable hand should possess. Lady Kalia scrambled backward, her mask of cold composure finally shattering, revealing the raw fear beneath. "You fool!" she shrieked. "She came willingly!" Celis wiped a trickle of blood from his temple, his chest heaving. She didn't agree to be put in chains. He advanced on her, the bloody axe held loosely at his side. "You will ride back to your master," he snarled, his voice like gravel. "And you will tell him that the debt of House Valemont died with Lord Cashin. If you or anyone else from your house ever comes near her again, I will not send you running. I will send you to your graves." She stared at him, then at Livia, and then, without another word, she turned and fled into the woods. He cut Livia's bonds, his touch surprisingly gentle. Her wrists were raw and bruised. I thought if I gave myself up you would be safe," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears of shame and relief. He framed her face with his hands, his gaze intense. "You are not mine to give away, Livia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I will die before I let anyone take you." She finally broke, collapsing against him, and he held her, rocking her gently as she sobbed. They were safe, for now. But as they made their way back to the barn, Celis knew this was far from over. Lady Kalia was not a woman who forgave insults. House Briarhelm was not a power to be trifled with. He had won the battle, but the war was just beginning, and their only hope rested on a desperate letter sent to an aunt who might not even exist. A week passed in a tense, fragile peace. Every sound, every shadow, sent a jolt of fear through Livia. But Lady Kalia did not return. Then, a letter arrived. Not on cheap paper, but on soft, expensive parchment, sealed with shimmering silver wax. "Dearest niece," it read, in a strong, clear hand. "I have waited many years for a day I feared would never come. The moment I heard your father had cast you out, I made a vow that if you ever called for me, I would answer. My carriage will arrive within the fortnight. Do nothing. Wait for me. You are not alone anymore." It was signed, "Your loving aunt, Rosand." Livia read it aloud, her voice trembling with a hope she hadn't dared to feel. She looked at Celis, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was going to be okay. They were going to be okay. But even as that beautiful, fragile hope bloomed in her chest, a chill snaked its way down her spine. Because in the long shadows of the nearby hills, a figure was watching them. It wasn't one of Lady Kalia's men. It was a man, dressed all in white. And he was smiling. He didn't approach them directly. He just appeared one afternoon, leaning against a fence post at the edge of the woods, as casual as if he were waiting for a friend. His coat was impossibly white, his boots clean, his posture relaxed. He held no weapon, but there was an aura of absolute confidence around him, a stillness that was more menacing than any drawn sword. Livia saw him first. She was grooming one of the horses, humming a soft tune, the letter from her aunt tucked safely in her apron. The sight of him made the tune die in her throat. The curry comb slipped from her hand and clattered onto the cobblestones. "Celis," she whispered, her voice tight with a sudden, inexplicable fear. Celis stepped out of the barn, saw the man, and instantly went still. All the quiet gentleness vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, wary tension. The man in white raised a hand in a lazy, mocking greeting. "Good afternoon," he called out, his voice pleasant, conversational. It didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Turn around and walk away," Celis said, his voice a low rumble. The man chuckled, a soft, unsettling sound. "Now, is that any way to greet a new acquaintance? I heard about your little run-in with the Briarhelm collectors. Very impressive. Most people fold when Lady Kalia applies pressure. You didn't." Celis took a step forward, placing himself between Livia and the stranger. "I said walk away." "Oh, I'm not with Briarhelm," the man said, his smile widening. "Not officially. Let's just say I handle delicate situations they prefer not to get their own hands dirty with. You could call me a consultant. Then go consult with them about the fact that their debt is a lie and they're never getting a single coin," Celis snarled. "Oh, I'm sure they're not," the man agreed easily. "But that's where you're mistaken. This was never about the money." He reached into his pristine white coat and pulled out a small black card. He didn't offer it. He simply let it flutter from his fingers and land in the dust at Livia's feet. "You were never the debt, Lady Livia," he said, his pleasant voice suddenly laced with venom. "You were the wager." Livia's blood ran cold. What are you talking about?" "A high-stakes game," the man explained, his eyes glittering. "Between your father and my employer. Your father lost, you see. He lost everything. And in a final desperate move, he wagered the only thing he had left of any value." He gestured towards her with a flick of his wrist. "You." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The debt, the threats, Lady Kalia. It was all a lie, a cover for something much, much worse. She wasn't a debtor. She was a prize, a piece of property to be claimed. "Tell your master," Celis growled, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "that if he wants her, he can come and try to take her himself." The man's smile grew even wider, a terrifying slash of white in his handsome face. "Oh, he will," he promised. "He most certainly will." And with that, he turned and strolled back towards the woods, his white coat disappearing among the trees like a phantom. They stood there in silence, the black card lying in the dust between them. Livia bent down and picked it up. On it, embossed in silver, was a crest she didn't recognize, 2 ravens circling an iron gate. That night, Livia didn't sleep. She stared up at the barn's rafters, the man's words echoing in her mind. You were the wager. Her entire life, her entire identity, had been a lie. She was a pawn in a game she didn't even know was being played. Celis sat by the fire, sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the suffocating silence. "He's already here, isn't he?" she whispered into the darkness. "The master." Celis didn't stop sharpening. "Men like that don't announce their arrival," he said, his voice grim. "They send messengers to let you know the storm is coming. Then they sit back and wait for the lightning to strike." Tears burned behind her eyes. "I'm not worth this. I'm not worth you dying." The scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. She turned her head and saw that he was watching her, his face a mixture of anger and a deep, aching sadness. "Don't you ever say that again," he said, his voice quiet but laced with iron. "Your father, and men like him, they treat people like property, love like a commodity. But the things they discard, the people they break, that's not the end of the story. That's just the beginning." He set the axe down and came to her, kneeling by her cot. "What they tried to bury is what you're going to use to fight back." He took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't feel broken. She felt held. 3 days later, Lady Rosen's carriage arrived. It was not a grand, ostentatious affair, but elegant and sturdy, pulled by 2 magnificent white horses. Lady Rosalind herself was even more impressive. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with the wisdom of years, and her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked at Livia, her gaze taking in the torn dress, the weary expression, and her stern face softened. She opened her arms. "My poor dear child," she murmured, her embrace fierce and strong. "I should have come for you years ago." That evening, as they shared a simple meal under the stars, Rosalind told them about her home in the north, a rugged, remote place far from the scheming and cruelty of the southern courts. A sanctuary. For the first time, Livia allowed herself to imagine a future. A life of peace. A life with Silas. But Silas wasn't eating. He was staring into the darkness at the edge of the woods, his body tense. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low. And then they heard it. A high-pitched, terrified scream. It wasn't human, it was the horses. They ran towards the trees. Rosalind's beautiful carriage was engulfed in flames, a roaring funeral pyre against the night sky. The two white horses were gone, and crumpled in the dirt near the fire was the body of Rosalind's driver, a knife buried in his back. Livia stared in horror, the smoke choking her, the heat searing her face. Rosalind's face had turned to stone. "They were watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "They waited." Silas knelt by the body, his expression grim. This wasn't Briarhelm's work. This was cleaner, more professional. "I know who it is," Rosalind said, her eyes meeting Livia's. They were filled with a cold, terrifying certainty. "The House of Holland." The name meant nothing to Livia, but Silas let out a string of curses under his breath. "Lord Cashin's greatest rival," Rosalind explained, her voice tight. "He publicly ruined Lord Holland in a dispute over land and titles, humiliated him, made him beg. That card you found, the two ravens, that is their sigil. They have been waiting years for their revenge, and now they plan to take it through you." "Then we fight them," Silas snarled. "You can't," Rosalind said, her voice filled with a sudden weariness. "They don't fight fair. They use hunters, assassins. They will wear you down, break you, before you ever even see Lord Holland's face." "Then what do we do?" Livia asked, her voice shaking. Rosalind's eyes were grim. "We make you disappear." The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. Rosalind would ride north alone, creating a false trail for Holland's men to follow. Livia and Silas would escape through the old, dried-up riverbeds, a treacherous path that no one had used in years. On foot, with no supplies, they would become ghosts. It almost worked. For 2 days they traveled in silence, scrambling over rocks and through thorny brush, the fear of pursuit a constant companion. But on the evening of the second day, as they were navigating a narrow ravine, Livia heard a noise, a soft scraping sound from the rocks above. Before she could even shout a warning, the ground beneath their feet gave way. It wasn't a natural rock slide. It was a trap. Livia screamed as the earth crumbled, plunging them into darkness. Silas grabbed for her, but it was too late. They tumbled down into the abyss, a suffocating avalanche of rock and dust swallowing them whole. They landed in a heap at the bottom of the pit, bruised and battered. And as the dust began to settle, a figure appeared at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the twilight sky. It was the man in white. His coat was still immaculate, and he was smiling down at them. "Well now," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I do so love it when they make things interesting." But as Livia looked up, she saw he wasn't alone. Lady Rosalind stood beside him, and Silas wasn't in the pit with her. He was standing at the top, next to them, his face a mask of stone. He had led her here. He had betrayed her. The betrayal was a physical blow, sharper than any rock, deeper than any cut. It knocked the air from Livia's lungs and left her gasping in the dust at the bottom of the ravine. Silas. Her Silas. The man who had shown her kindness, who had defended her, who had held her and promised her protection. He was one of them. He had led her into this trap. "I'm sorry, Livia," he said from the ledge above, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. But his eyes were screaming. Lady Rosund, or whoever she really was, laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Oh, don't look so heartbroken, dear girl. It was never about you. It was business." She gestured to Celas. "He made a deal with my husband, Lord Holland. Your life, for his." "No," Livia whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't believe you." It was the man in white who answered, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "It's true. He's been working for us for months, playing the part of the loyal slave, all to get close to you. Your father's little punishment was the perfect opportunity." Celas wouldn't look at her. He just stared out at the horizon, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. The man in white made a signal, and 2 of Holland's guards lowered a rope ladder into the pit. "Lord Holland is expecting you," he said. "Don't keep him waiting." Livia couldn't move. Her body was broken, but her heart was shattered into a million pieces. The guards descended and hauled her to her feet. The pain in her shoulder was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the agony of Celas's betrayal. As they tied her hands, her eyes met his one last time. She saw a flicker of something in their depths, anguish, regret, a desperate plea for understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. They dragged her out of the ravine and into the darkness. She was a prisoner once more, but this time, there was no hope of rescue. The man who had been her savior was the very devil who had delivered her to her doom. They took her to a hidden camp, a wretched collection of tents and cages tucked away in a remote canyon, and it was there that she learned the full, horrifying truth. She wasn't the first. She wasn't the only one. The camp was filled with women, dozens of them. All of them were wagers or debts collected by Lord Holland over the years. They were ghosts, forgotten by the world, their spirits as broken as their bodies. They told Livia their stories in hushed, terrified whispers. Stories of noble families ruined, of daughters sold to settle scores, of a brutal system of human trafficking hidden behind the veneer of aristocratic disputes. And they told her about Celas. He wasn't just a traitor. His story was as tragic as their own. His younger sister, Anya, had been one of the first girls taken by Holland. Celas had allowed himself to be sold into slavery, working his way into the system, enduring years of abuse and degradation, all for the slim chance of one day finding her. Joining Holland's inner circle and betraying Livia was the final terrible price for his sister's freedom. Livia found Anya in one of the sick tents. She was frail, her eyes clouded with fever, but she had Celas's stubborn chin and a fire that even her illness couldn't extinguish. "He loves you," Anya whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "This is killing him. He talks about you in his sleep. He thinks you're the only good thing he's ever known." Anya told her that Lord Holland planned to make a public spectacle of Livia. He was going to parade her in front of his allies, a symbol of his power, a warning to all his rivals. He was going to break her, body and soul, for the entire world to see. Lying there in the dirt, surrounded by the lost and the broken, Livia felt something shift inside her. The pain of betrayal was still there, a raw, open wound, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking root. A cold, hard resolve, a burning, righteous fury. Her father had tried to break her. Celas had been forced to betray her. Lord Holland wanted to turn her into a trophy. They had all underestimated her. They saw a weak, fat, helpless girl. They didn't see the survivor. They didn't see the fighter. She and Anya devised a plan, a desperate, crazy plan. They found one of the camp's trustees, an old woman whose spirit had been crushed long ago, and bribed her with the last of Livia's meager possessions, the button from her sleeve, to take a message to Celas. The message was simple, just 5 words scrawled on a piece of scrap leather. "I am not the prize. I am the bomb." The day of the claiming ceremony arrived. The camp was buzzing with a nervous energy. Lord Holland and his men were dressed in their finest, a grotesque display of wealth and power in the midst of so much misery. Livia was dragged from her tent, washed, and forced into a fine silk gown, a cruel parody of her former life. She was led to a raised platform in the center of the camp. Lord Holland stood waiting for her, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. The man in white was at his side, his eyes glittering with anticipation. Celis stood behind them, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Lord Holland took her hand and raised it to the crowd of assembled nobles and thugs. "Behold!" he boomed. "The final payment for the sins of House Valemont, a testament to the power of the House of Holland." Livia looked out at the sea of faces, the leering men, the broken women, the indifferent guards. She felt a wave of despair wash over her. It was hopeless. She was alone. But then her eyes found Celis. He was looking at her, and for the first time since her capture, his mask slipped. She saw the torment in his eyes, the self-loathing, the desperate love. And in his hand, almost hidden from view, he was clutching her button. He had gotten her message. As Lord Holland droned on, Livia took a deep breath. She remembered the stories of the other women. She remembered Anya's feverish grip on her hand. She remembered Celis's kindness in the barn. She remembered his promise, "I will stand between you and anyone who tries to take you." He had broken that promise. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to keep it. She met his eyes across the platform, and she nodded. It was all the signal he needed. Celis didn't attack Lord Holland. He didn't draw a weapon. He did something much more clever, much more devastating. With a sudden, swift movement, he kicked over a large brazier, sending a cascade of burning coals rolling towards a row of tents where Holland's men stored their black powder. The explosion was deafening. It ripped through the camp, sending bodies and debris flying. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, Celis grabbed a sword from a fallen guard and began to fight his way towards the platform. But he wasn't the only one fighting. At the same moment as the explosion, the women of the camp rose up. Armed with sharpened sticks, rocks, and the sheer force of their collective rage, they fell upon their captors. It was a suicidal, glorious rebellion, a tidal wave of vengeance years in the making. Livia used the chaos to her advantage. She shoved the stunned Lord Holland aside and scrambled off the platform, grabbing a fallen dagger. She fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed, her movements clumsy but driven by a desperate will to survive. The battle was a bloody, swirling vortex of violence. Livia fought her way through the melee, searching for Celis. She found him locked in a deadly duel with the man in white. They were perfectly matched, a whirlwind of flashing steel and grim determination. Lord Holland, his face purple with rage, recovered and drew his own sword. He saw Livia and advanced on her, his eyes burning with hatred. "You worthless creature!" he screamed. "I will kill you myself!" He was bigger, stronger, a more experienced fighter. Livia knew she couldn't win. But as he raised his sword for the killing blow, a figure flew through the air and tackled him from the side. It was Anya, her feverish strength fueled by adrenaline and a lifetime of rage. But the rebellion was failing. There were too many guards, too well armed. The women were being pushed back, their brave uprising on the verge of being crushed. And then, a new sound cut through the din of battle, a war horn. Over the ridge of the canyon, an army appeared, hundreds of them, farmers, ranchers, former slaves, the common folk of the surrounding lands, all armed with hunting rifles, pitchforks, and axes. They poured into the canyon, a tide of righteous fury, but it was the person at their head that made Livia's jaw drop. It was Lady Callia Thorne. She rode at the front of the charge, a sword in her hand, her face a mask of cold, determined fury. She was not an enemy, she was an ally. The debt, the threats, it had all been a charade, a test. Her family, House Briarhelm, had been rivals of Holland for years, not over land, but over honor. They had suspected Holland's depravity, but could never prove it. The story of Livia's debt was a gambit to get close, to gauge the situation. When Celis had rescued Livia, Callia knew she had found people with the will to fight back. She had been the one funding and organizing the local resistance all along. The tide of the battle turned instantly. Holland's men, caught between the rebelling captives and the arriving army, broke and fled. Lord Holland, seeing his empire crumbling around him, made a last, desperate move. He grabbed Anya, holding a knife to her throat. "Everyone back!" he shrieked, "or the girl dies!" Celis and the man in white were still locked in their duel. Celis, distracted by Holland's threat, faltered. The man in white seized the opportunity, disarming him with a swift, brutal move. He held his sword to Celis's throat. "It's over," the man in white sneered. "You lose." He was wrong. A shot rang out, not from a rifle but from a pistol. The man in white stiffened, a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his pristine white coat. Then he collapsed. Livia stood a few feet away, a smoking pistol in her hand. She had snatched it from a fallen guard. Her hand was shaking, but her aim had been true. In that moment of shock, Celis lunged forward, tackling Lord Holland and freeing Anya. The battle was over. The camp was liberated. As the survivors tended to their wounded and celebrated their newfound freedom, Celis found Livia. They stood in the midst of the devastation, the air thick with the smell of smoke and blood. "Livia," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. She didn't let him finish. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him into a fierce, forgiving kiss. The war was over, but their story was just beginning. They didn't go back. There was nothing to go back to. Livia's old home was a place of ghosts and painful memories. The ruins of Lord Holland's camp, however, became something new. A sanctuary. They called it River Camp. The freed women, the local farmers, the former slaves, they stayed. Together, they began to build a new community from the ashes of the old one. A place founded not on bloodlines and power, but on mutual respect and shared survival. Livia, the girl who had been cast out for being unworthy, became their leader, not by title, but by action. She organized, she mediated disputes, she worked alongside everyone else, her hands becoming calloused, her spirit becoming stronger with every passing day. Celis was her shadow, her partner in everything. The guilt of his betrayal still haunted him, but Livia's forgiveness was a healing balm. He taught the others how to hunt, how to fortify the camp, how to defend themselves. He and Anya, now recovering and reunited, were inseparable. One evening, as they sat by the river, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Livia turned to him. "We need a school," she said. He smiled. "A school? For what?" "To teach them to read," she said, her eyes shining with a fierce new purpose. "To write their own names, to sign their own contracts, to ensure that no one can ever trick them or steal their lives with a piece of paper again." He looked at her, his heart swelling with a love so powerful it almost hurt. This was the woman he had fallen for in that dusty barn, the woman who had seen kindness in a slave and had the strength to build a new world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a ring, crudely woven from a strip of leather, with a smooth gray riverstone set in the center. "I made this for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "back in the camp. I was going to give it to you, but I didn't think I deserved to." Livia took his hand. "We both have scars, Celis," she whispered. "But that doesn't make us undeserving. It makes us survivors." He slid the simple ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. A year later, the first building of the school was complete. Livia stood before a group of eager children, chalk in her hand, a small, round swell visible beneath her apron. She was teaching them their letters when Celis walked in, his face breaking into a wide grin when he saw her. He walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her, resting his hands on her belly. "She's going to be strong," he murmured into her hair. "Yes," Livia said, leaning back against him. "Like her mother." They looked out at the thriving community they had built. A place of hope, a place of freedom, a place where the broken and the discarded could find a home. Their journey had started with a cruel punishment, a final act of hatred from a man who saw his daughter as a failure, but he had been wrong. Her father hadn't thrown her away. He had set her free. Free to find her own strength. Free to find a love that was not a transaction, but a partnership. Free to build a better world, not with gold and titles, but with courage, kindness, and an unbreakable will. They were told they were worthless. They were told they were property. But they learned that true love isn't something you can own, or wager, or sell. It's something you build together from the ground up. If you believe in building a better world and want to hear more stories of justice, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.